everyone. My name is Reed Coverdale, and you're watching The Naturalist Capitalist, and I've got Horatio William Smith on with me. How you doing, man?
Hey, doing very well. Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure. So, like I told you right before we started recording, you're one of the only informed people on Twitter. I really like your stuff. So why don't you just tell us a little bit about who you are, how you know what you know about our financial system and our monetary policy and everything, because that's what you talk a lot about. Just give us a little background on who you are and what you do.
No, actually, I appreciate the nod to saying I have an informed opinion. In terms of my interest in politics, I think that I started taking an interest in politics during the 1992 elections. It was the second grade, and I was a huge Ross Perot supporter. Before switching over to Clinton at the very last moment after Ross Perot dropped out. And over the years, of course, really stayed in tune with the political cycles, reading, studying poli sci in college before ultimately then transitioning to business. And so I took several economics courses that were very objective in the the instruction. Now that I see how biased college instructional economics can be. And that was both at the undergrad and graduate level. And so a lot of those, items that I learned in school, compounded with, just staying informed and, really truly just, discerning between, what's real, what's fake, and, using objectivity. It's kind of allowed me to form the opinions I have now.
Yeah, that's cool. So who do you feel like does the most mind controlling? Is it the politicians? Is it the media? Is it Hollywood, or is it just everything? Like, who, in your opinion, is the biggest twister of the truth these days?
Right. I think that the media obviously twists, the truth the most, specifically to, fit in, to news cycles and to, maintain, the audience interaction with people who have, very, short, attention spans. The fact that, we're all, hyper connected right now through, various, social media platforms and through other forms of communication, I think that it's led an impetus for news to go beyond just providing information and to providing pseudo informed opinions, whereas really it's entertainment.
Right. Do you think Americans are just stupid, and even if we had all the information laid out in front of us, we would still choose to be misinformed? Do you think that's part of the problem, or do you think it's just that the information we get is so messed up?
Yeah, I mean, if we're going to be completely honest, I mean, if you had asked me the same question 10 years ago, I would have said, Americans, heck, no, we're not stupid. We're, the most informed, we're the most, educated, group of human beings on the face of the planet. But the more that I see the type of personalities that have dominated our politics and, our overall refusal, to do anything about it in a substantial way, I've only been led to believe that, the average American cannot be as intelligent, as I believe for them to be. I think that we are the beneficiaries of, systems, that were set up, before our lifetimes, for the most part. And we've been able to bear the fruit of being born in a very resource, heavy, nation. And then, of course, being founded upon, ideas that have kind of permeated throughout the centuries. But today versus, Enlightenment era, Americans, I would say that, we're definitely not, the cream of the crop across the board. And so even if we were, presented with all the information, we really have all the information at our fingertips, right? So it's really a lack of an ability to embrace, that information.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I mean, I feel like when you try to tell people something that's not demonstrated as mainstream truth, they get angry at you. If you try to open their eyes to what's going on, they actually get upset. From watching you on Twitter and everything, you seem like a very independent-minded person. Is there any party that you would align with mostly, or are they just like all complete crap and you just kind of pick and choose from each one, or is there one that you think has some hope of representing the truth someday?
Hey, once again, 15 years ago, I was what was considered a blue dog Democrat, right? So I aligned with, conservative-oriented Democrats who, were, of course, I'm a believer, so, I believe it's okay to say Jesus as a Democrat. I think that it's okay to have a balanced budget and, to, look for a centrist, third way approach. And, I really believe that delivered, sums for the Democrats. But this particular party that has, no anchor, I don't really identify with the Democrats. And of course, the Republicans are not very hospitable, to, any sort of compassion whatsoever. So I believe that, pretty much those two major parties are gone astray. And I like ideas from the Libertarian Party and the Green Party, for that matter. But for the most part, it's hard to say I am emotionally attached to any of the major parties in the United States.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Something you said to me was that you feel like Donald Trump has kind of given an excuse for people like Joe Biden and Kamala Harris to appear as though they're progressive or though they're game-changing people, even though they're the people who basically Joe Biden basically laid the groundwork for a lot of the problems we have, and then Kamala Harris exacerbated a lot of those problems in California. But Trump is just so vile, and the Republican Party is so obnoxious that it's almost the Republican Party's fault that the Democrats are getting away with acting that way, because they're just so obscene.
And I wouldn't even say the Republican Party as a whole. I understand that Trumpism it's a different animal than what I've seen in my lifetime in terms of politics and demagoguery. So whereby, if you're going to be someone like, a Bob Corker or, someone who tries to, or even Ben Sass in Nebraska, who I feel, provides a level of gravity from time to time, you're going to be wiped out. Trump is going to, sick the attack dogs on him. And irrespective of what the vast majority of Americans think, Trump has a very robust, favorability within the Republican Party. And so it has kind of pooled and polarized Republicans to tame down, some of, their, inclinations to reprimand him. But as we discussed, Trump is really and truly, he's a byproduct of a system where people felt they weren't getting a fair shake. And so you had someone who was unorthodox who came to the forefront and said, you know what, I'm not going to be like, the standard politicians who are promoting the same status quo year after year. I'm different. And by that, effort, he was able to wipe out 16 pretty well-established Republican, combatants, if we want to call it that, in 2016. I mean, it was really truly a good list of people he was campaigning against.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So something a lot of people say, and I think they're right, is that Trump isn't part of the problem. He's a symptom of the problem, and I understand that rationale. But I do think that he's made the problems worse.
Right.
He doesn't. It's a fine line between just exposing the problems and actually exacerbating them. I feel like he hasn't really done anything to improve any of the bad systems we already had. I would say the only thing I'd give him is that he hasn't started a new full-on war. But aside from that, I can't really give him any credit anywhere.
No. And then he hired John Bolton, which, for anyone who was paying attention from, 2000 to 2008, John Bolton, Wolfowitz, those people are all persona non grata with me, all the neoconservatives. So Bolton was pushing very heavily for us to go to war with Iran.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's funny because Trump is shredding Bolton to pieces right now in his foreign policy. He's acting as though that's something new about Bolton that came out after I hired him. It's like, dude, if you had done your research, this guy was terrible. He's been terrible forever. It's not a new thing for him. So
Absolutely.
Yeah. So do you think going back to Biden or continuing with Trump would be worse, or is it 6 on one, half a dozen on the other?
Yeah, I am one of the masses that begrudgingly will likely vote for Biden. I live in Texas, so there's a strong likelihood that Donald Trump is going to carry the state of Texas. And if Donald Trump carries the state of Texas in a decisive fashion, and it's showing so before Election Day, I'm going to vote for someone else. I'm going to lodge my protest vote. But ultimately, for the nation as a whole, I think that Biden's status quo, although it's not necessarily progressive or transformative in really fixing the political systems that we have, it's a lot better from Trump lurching us towards self-destruction piece by piece. And really and truly, one of the most destructive things is where he's prodding the Federal Reserve to do things that, otherwise they would not do. And I think that, one of your last, guests on the show, I think it was Nick, brought up the fact that a lot of people don't understand the Federal Reserve. And so they're not, quite aware of just how problematic it is. Some of the things that Trump is doing to prompt the Federal Reserve to inflate our monetary system.
Yeah, I think it was Zach who was on that was talking. Yeah. Yeah. So if he chooses Kamala Harris, will that have any negative bearings on your choice to vote for him? Or how would that affect what you think of him?
It's a no vote, right? I mean, I'm not going to vote against him because of Kamala Harris, but it doesn't endear me, to Joe Biden for Kamala Harris. I think that when we look at her, she's very photogenic. She's a very attractive woman. I give her credit for that. I think that, she presents well, but when you really and truly ask yourself, what aspect of Kamala Harris's platform stuck out, from her time running for president, nothing sticks out. She wasn't, exceptional or a particularly vigorous advocate for anything. I know that people want to tie her to criminal justice reform, but she's a former prosecutor who didn't do anything for, the people of, San Francisco when she was a DA there. And from what I've read, her office was willing to actually keep, people in jail, for a longer period of time, just so that they could help fight forest fires. It doesn't sound like a progressive, reformer to me. So she doesn't do anything for me in terms of warm and fuzzies.
Yeah, no, I mean, maybe it's because I was supporting Tulsi Gabbard in the primary, but the only thing that stuck out to her about me was how terrible she was as a DA and how what you were just talking about with the firefighters, all those things that's the only thing that stood out to her about me. So what would you say the most important change we need to have going forward is now? Is it monetary policy? Is it fixing our police or criminal justice system? Or what is one issue that really has to change, or we'll be screwed if we don't address it?
Being for it, as much as, I'm a big believer in, criminal justice reform and, a believer that, it could have, dramatic, effects on a large swath of the American population if, changed. We have to change, how we go about creating wealth and who we're allowing to create wealth. A lot of people don't realize that, banking institutions, when they create loans, and when they determine who is getting a loan and who's not getting a loan, they are choosing between the winners and the losers.
Right.
And they're effectively creating money out of nowhere, vis-a-vis creating wealth. And that disconnect and the average American not understanding that is problematic. And I think that someone like Elizabeth Warren, although she has her quirks, she was someone who understood the financial system very intensely. And she's someone who could articulate some of the issues that were wrong with the financial system and why it's so harmful to the average American that irrespective of what happens in our current economy, whether, there's a downturn or whether, there's a huge uptick, you rarely see billionaires who go bankrupt ever. You never see the billionaire who's, overly exposed, to any sort of hazard, irrespective of where their fortunes lie. And that's because of the fact that they've been able to benefit from a system whereby they can get loans at cheap rates. Their businesses can go on. They can be shielded from any liability through various holding companies, and so their wealth is protected, and they're able to go from company to company, bankruptcy to bankruptcy, and maintain their wealth despite the fact that being forward, if our lending institutions were good arbitrators, they would not continue to lend money to some of these people who are terrible business people.
Right. So so you probably know from following me a lot that my position on a lot of these things is that we actually need to remove the government from protecting certain entities, because the idea behind a lot of the laws we have is they're supposed to protect the little guy, but they actually end up protecting the big guy, and the little guy doesn't have enough lawyers or power to use those laws to protect himself. And so we just see the top benefiting off of them and the bottom just gets screwed. Do you think there's hope to fix the system, or do you agree kind of more with me that we need to just pull out and let the natural market kind of come in and fix things? Do you think we need things like universal basic income, or do you think it's something that if we let the market go, it'll work itself out?
When we look at universal basic income, I think that that's independent from the conversation on wealth distribution and how the economic impacts of increasing wealth stratification, right? Because
Yeah.
UBI is essentially addressing an inevitability, right? Automation, artificial intelligence, are going to wipe out most of the jobs that most of us do now.
Mhm.
And yes, there will be engineers, whatever the case may be, but at the end of the day, a lot of us may not be able to do productive work in the way that we've done it for centuries and centuries. And so that has, I think it has consideration. But when we look at where we are now as a nation, right, and the fact that there's just such a high concentration of wealth. I haven't looked at the Gini coefficient, measuring wealth, inequality, but the last time I looked, I think it was at like 56. So we are very, we're very unequal in terms of like how our wealth is distributed as a nation.
Right.
And it has to be fixed, by the government coming back in and fixing some of those issues. I don't believe that it should be a long-term, system where government intervention is there. But even Adam Smith in Wealth of Nations, advocated for government intervention when it needed, to correct markets, at the point that they were, beyond, just normal means, right? Where the market had become whack, the government's able to intervene, right? The invisible hand isn't the all-powerful, all-knowing, all-seeing, all-doing invisible hand. There's a place for government, but I think that the issue comes into effect. Okay, well, where does regulations, reforms, how significant should they be? And then, of course, at what point do we ask the government to then, draw back and allow, whatever happened to happen?
Right. I don't necessarily disagree with that. I mean, I am a free market person, but the government has already screwed it up to such a large level and boosted the top that I'm completely sympathetic toward an argument of reintervention to help the bottom. The only problem is I don't trust any system that we have to actually do that effectively. And so how do we get a system like that? I mean, it seems like we'd have to vote everybody out, and we'd have to I mean, I see you say that a lot. Vote them all out. That's probably the only way forward, right? So.
Oh yeah. I mean, and I think that where I'm at, in terms of like this journey is not just voting them out and not just speaking about term limits, but really and truly trying to codify, what is the optimum level, or optimum amount of time that anyone should stay in a seat of power, right? When we think about presidents and we have presidents elected for 2 terms. I think there's also the consideration, do we really need 2-term presidents, right? One person to be in office for that amount of time, or should we have 1-term presidents like in Mexico and extend out the tenure? Should senators, be able to be in office for multiple terms, or should it be a single term of service? When you're in DC for that long, you're so disconnected from the average, part of your constituency that, you're more of a DC resident than you are, like Mitch McConnell. Mitch McConnell's been in D.C. for however many number of years. His wife has worked in a number of administrations. They live in D.C. They're not residents of Kentucky. They have no alignment with Kentucky whatsoever. So I think that there is a level of out of touch that a lot of these congressional members have, that it can only be reconciled with term limits.
Yeah. What do you think about like campaign finance reform and lobbyists? Are those things we have to legislate away, or could we remove those by reducing the power of government so that people don't feel obligated to lobby or donate to campaigns in the first place? What do you think the right solution for that is?
Really and truly, I think it's a matter of what kind of message can you send to the American people? Because I think that we can kind of discuss all of these changes and reforms and be very high-minded and express it, but really and truly, it's going to be a matter of can you sell this to the American people in such a way that there's a fury around it, and that they cause legislators to act, right? Like
Right.
When you look at something like estate taxes, and they called it a death tax. All of a sudden, the average American saying, well, I don't want to be, have my loved ones, taxed unfairly, just because of, the fact that, I've passed away and I want to pass them on something, not realizing that, most of the people who were affected by the high-end estate taxes were high net worth individuals, and so that money's gone, but really and truly, it's only benefited the wealthiest of the wealthy, right? So I think that you could go and you can make an argument for the fact that you could just limit government so that lobbyists, have, less of a sway. But I think that lobbyists, because they are smart, if we're forward, right, the smartest among us are in, they're in the free market. They're corrupt and they're in the free market. They're the ones who are in the private sector, making things happen, for private sector enterprises, and our public sector employees, for the most part, are just not as competent because we're not paying them as much. And so lobbyists will find a way to, of course, expand, government, at their pleasure. And I think that that's why it might make sense to codify it in some sort of reform. I hate K Street.
Right. No, I got you. So you seem to be really good at talking on a level that regular Americans can understand, and that's what I try to do too. Because a lot of these economists, if you listen to them, unless you actually know what's going on, it's kind of like, your head's just like, whoa, what's going on here? I try to bring things down onto a personal level that people in the real world will understand. They can see why these policies actually hurt them. Do you have other? Do you do this in other places other than online, like in real life? Do you talk a lot to people about this stuff? Like, how does that go?
Without question. And again, it's a matter of, like, even now, having the conversation whereby you try to paint a portrait of Joe Biden and you present him as not much different from Donald Trump, right? The only difference is he's a career politician versus, Donald Trump being, in real estate. They really have a lot of, similar personality types in terms of, intelligence, winning personality over, aptitude. But that argument is so hard to make because of, other factors, right? And so we try to explain something as, robust and complicated as the Federal Reserve, when the market itself, who are, very competent people on Wall Street who don't understand everything that Jerome Powell is saying, that's where, you get lost in the weeds, where you can, try to break it down and, you try to, help people understand the minutia, but they just don't get it. They just don't get it.
Yeah. No, yeah. What actually brought me into it was real life experience. So working with people who didn't make enough money, but they'd still get a loan for a house that was, $300,000, and they'd get a 30-year mortgage, or they'd buy a car that there's no way they had the right to buy, but they could because they'd get this crazy loan. And so I just started digging deeper into why all of this was possible. And then when you start tracing it all back, it goes back to our monetary system and the Federal Reserve. And so then I started listening to economists and finding out about all these problems. So for me, I feel like most people probably don't arrive at it that way. They're probably listening to someone and they hear about it and then they get interested in it. For me, it was seeing it in real life. So I think that's the most effective way to communicate to other people, because let's face it, Americans are selfish. They don't really care about anything inside their little circle. So if you can prove to them that the Federal Reserve basically doing whatever it wants to without us really knowing exactly what's going on all the time, that's actually harmful to them, not that it's just some abstract political minutia, then then you can actually hit home with them.
Yeah. Have you ever watched The Big Short?
Yes.
So here's this beautiful movie, right? Very, well produced. Michael Lewis is a great author. I've read Liar's Poker. I thought he did a great job with that, kind of showing the waste on Wall Street. He did a beautiful job painting the portrait of just what went wrong, during the 2007, 2008 financial crisis, right?
Right.
And this is broadcast to a mainstream audience, broken down in such a way that, I envied it. People still do not see the parallels between what happened in 2008 to 2007, 2008, and what's happening right now. And the fact that we're still taking on more debt. Truly, what our GDP to debt ratio is insane.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's funny because I really started investigating into the 2008 crisis because I was pretty young when it happened, so I wasn't paying too much attention. I was in middle school or something.
Yeah.
But then I started researching it in like January of this year, and I started listening to a ton of different economists. And so I was like fresh off the skittle with the skillet with the information, and then everything that's happening now started happening, and I was just like, It's like, this is exactly the same thing that's going on. And you're right. Nobody cares. Nobody knows what's going on. No one's paying attention. It's just insane. So.
And even like the biggest uproar, which I was waiting for it from my conservative friends who, always preach, laissez-faire economics. And then, of course, from some of my liberal friends, who, of course, argue, for, not to, bail out, large corporations. But, the Federal Reserve actually is buying, the corporate bonds directly this week.
Yeah.
Should be a violation of the Federal Reserve Act. But they've been able to set up a limited liability corporation or, some sort of corporation to get around this and bypass the law. Absolutely no fuss, no furor over this from either the right or the left. No substantial, uproar over this. And it's $4 trillion. $4 trillion that the Federal Reserve has decided that they're going to put into our economy to allow companies to take on more debt. So these individuals who have already shown that they don't have the ability to manage debt levels, and they're willing to use debt, to buy stocks because that's what's tied, into their executive compensation. We're allowing these same companies to go back and borrow more money. It's a comedy of errors. It makes absolutely no sense, to the average American, and yet we've allowed it to happen. And we're not saying anything, nothing. Like, it drives me nuts.
Yeah, and you're so right about, talk is big from the conservatives and the progressives about responsible spending and transparency and big bailouts. But then with the CARES Act, when that went through, almost everyone voted for it on both sides. Bernie Sanders, Ted Cruz, and then the only couple people who really stood up against it were like Thomas Massie and Justin Amash, and they got shredded by everybody. They were getting Thomas Massie was getting threatened to get thrown out of the Republican Party and get primaried in his election. And, so you have, what do we have, like 500 people in Congress, and we have like 3 people in all of Congress who stand up to this, and most of them get vilified, by the party establishment and by the media. So, I mean, if you can't even have Bernie Sanders, stand up against a corporate bailout, what have we got? It goes back to that idea you were saying earlier. We got to vote everybody out against our women. They just all so terrible.
I mean, when Donald Trump says, drain the swamp, I agree with the sentiment. Absolutely. In execution, right, it's really truly draining the swamp of any opposition to Donald Trump. And I think that that's his modus operandi and a clear definition of Trumpism. It's really and truly, eliminating all barriers to Trump accumulating more power. And if he actually showed a modicum of restraint, whether it be on Twitter or in some of his executive actions, I firmly believe that Donald Trump would be he'd be well far ahead of Joe Biden right now. That's how far off Joe Biden is.
Yeah.
How empty his candidacy is. So.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. On my last show, I actually made a guess that Joe Biden is going to win this election. I think he's just going to barely sneak by. And the reason is not because he's good. It's because Trump has been so bad.
Right.
And you have like the hardcore MAGA people who there's no one else they're ever going to vote for. They'd vote for Trump if he started bombing Kansas. I mean, there's nothing you can do to stop them from voting for him. But there were a lot of people in 2016 who didn't like Hillary Clinton, and they were saying, okay, this guy's absolutely crazy, but he might do some of the stuff he's saying he's going to do. He might ruffle feathers in D.C. He might, really drain the swamp. He might shake things up. So screw it. I'm just going to vote for him. Yep. And he hasn't, he's only done that on a surface level. He's only been obnoxious. He hasn't really caused any turmoil with people in power. They might not like him as much as they'd like to have some other people, but for the most part, he doesn't do anything that disturbs them. He just lets them get away still. So.
Yeah, I mean, he forced John Boehner to retire, and Paul Ryan to essentially leave politics, and cede House leadership to Nancy Pelosi.
Right.
That's pretty much what he's been able to accomplish in terms of leadership change. I hate these people so much that I'm going to give them the minority in the House. And Nancy Pelosi is problematic also. Again, like anyone who's a second generation politician, I always view them leery. I just have a leery distrust of these, political dynasties, that take place.
Yeah.
Donald Trump was a refreshing, thought even to myself, because again, I'm not necessarily an obstructionist, but I do like to see the system rattled. And so even though I didn't agree with all of Donald Trump's platform, I hated the idea of a woman, who was, married to a president within the last, 16 years forward as the president of the United States. And the Democratic Party laid down for her. Her opposition was minimal. And Bernie Sanders, I think that Bernie's a nice guy. I think he's genuine in his convictions, but I think he's wrong in a lot of issues, to the point that most of Americans would not vote for Bernie Sanders in any shape or form. He's cantankerous, and from what I've seen, he's not a very effective politician.
No, yeah, I totally agree. Was there, out of all options we had this year in every party, if you could have chosen one of them, which one do you think you would have gone with?
I mean, if we looked at all options out of any party, the person who I liked the most in 2016 was actually John Kasich. I thought that he had a very balanced approach. I know that when he was in Congress, he was a lot more of a conservative, and conservative in the obstructionist conservative sense, not conservative in the sense that he had conservative values. But I think that that's also born out of the fact that, our congressional districts are so hyper polarized, right? They've been, drawn to the point to where you have to, for the most part, have extreme views because you're targeting a very select audience. Moving into a governorship, I think that he was a lot more broad in his thinking. I think he would have been a very effective, commander in chief. Elizabeth Warren, also, I liked her. She actually got my vote in the primary more so than anything else, just because of the fact that, she was going to shock the financial system and shock it in such a way that it would not be able to be business as usual. Mm-hmm. But I still laugh when Donald Trump calls her Pocahontas because I think it's funny, right? I don't have that same emotional investment in my politicians that other people do. They're tools to be utilized, for my politics. They're not there for me to be admired and for me to, give my undying devotion to.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to make a small confession on this show. I actually did vote for John Kasich in 2016 because nice. I was a Rand Paul supporter, but he dropped out before New Hampshire. So I actually did vote for him. What was attractive to me about him, even though I disagreed with him a lot on foreign policy and the drug war and things like that, I was impressed that he worked under Clinton on the budget committee and that was the last time we had a surplus in a long time. So I was willing to flip a coin on him, especially compared to the remaining options we had.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so that pretty much covers everything I was thinking of talking about. If there's anything else you want to say before we close out, if you want people to follow you on Twitter or YouTube or anywhere else, if you got any platforms or.
Yeah, my platforms are not fully built out, really and truly, even on Twitter, it's just my random, ruminations. But, I would just encourage, all of my fellow Americans, to continue to be, informed, challenge, what's being presented in terms of, from a political perspective and also from an economic perspective. And really and truly review, does it make sense? Does 1 + 1 really equal 2? Or do I believe that, 1 + 1 = 2 because they're telling me that it equals 2?
Well, I really want to thank you for coming on. I want to have you back again. You really understand all this stuff, and that's rare these days with anybody. So I really thank you for coming on, and we'll do it again.
Hey, appreciate your time. Appreciate your forethought. I think you're a political leader in this nation. So going to continue to encourage people to follow you as well.
All right, thanks, man. We'll catch you next time.
All right, you have a good one.